Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's Stories. We now return to America is in the Heart, a personal history by Carlos Bulosan. Part 2, Chapter 13. I found the dark hole of the steerage and lay on my bunk for days without food, seasick and lonely. I was restless at night and many disturbing thoughts came to my mind. Why had I left home? What would I do in America? I looked into the faces of my companions for a comforting answer, but they were as young and bewildered as I, and my only consolation was their proximity and the familiarity of their dialects. It was not until we had left Japan that I began to feel better. One day in mid-ocean, I climbed through the narrow passageway to the deck where other steerage passengers were sunning themselves. Most of them were Ilocanos, who were fishermen in the northern coastal regions of Luzon. They were talking easily and eating rice with salted fish with their bare hands, and some of them were walking barefoot and unconcerned in their homemade cotton shorts. The first-class passengers were annoyed, and an official of the boat came down and drove us back into the dark haven below. The small opening at the top of the iron ladder was shut tight, and we did not see the sun again until we had passed Hawaii. But before we anchored at Honolulu, an epidemic of meningitis spread throughout the boat and concentrated among the steerage passengers. The Chinese waiters stopped coming into our dining room because so many of us had been attacked by the disease. They pushed the tin plates under the door of the kitchen and ran back to their rooms, afraid of being contaminated. Those hungry enough crawled miserably on their bellies and reached for their plates. But somewhere in the room, a peasant boy was playing a guitar and another was strumming a mandolin. I lay on my bunk listening and wishing I could join them. In the far corner of the dining room, crouched around the dining table, 5 young students were discussing the coming presidential election in the United States. Not far from them was a dying boy from Pangasinan. One night, when I could no longer stand the heat in the closed room, I screamed aloud and woke up most of the steerage passengers. The boy who had been playing the guitar came to my bed with cold water and rubbed my forehead and back with it. I was relieved of my discomfort a little and told him so. "My name is Marcelo," I said. "My name is Marcelo," he said. "I came from San Miguel, Pangasinan." "San Miguel?" I said. "I used to work there, in the Mongo fields." "I am glad to meet you." "Go to sleep now," he said. "Call for me if you need my help." I heard his feet pattering away from me, and I was comforted. It was enough that Marcelo had come from a familiar town. It was a bond that bound us together in our journey, and I was to discover later this same regional friendship, which developed into tribalism, obstructed all efforts toward Filipino unity in America. There were more than 200 of us in the steerage. A young doctor and an assistant came now and then to check the number of deaths and to examine those about to die. It was only when we reached Hawaii that the epidemic was checked and we were allowed to go out again. Some of the stronger passengers carried their sick relatives and friends through the narrow hatch and put them in the sunlight. I was pleasantly sunning myself one afternoon when Marcelo rolled over on his stomach and touched me. I turned and saw a young white girl wearing a brief bathing suit walking toward us with a young man. They stopped some distance away from us. Then, as though the girl's moral conscience had been provoked, she put her small hand on her mouth and said in a frightened voice, "Look at those half-naked savages from the Philippines, Roger. Haven't they any idea of decency?" "I don't blame them for coming into the sun," the young man said. "I know how it is below." "Roger," said the terrified girl, "don't tell me you have been down in that horrible place. I simply can't believe it." The man said something, but they had already turned and the wind carried it away. I was to hear that girl's voice in many ways afterward in the United States. It became no longer her voice, but an angry chorus shouting, "Why don't they ship those monkeys back where they came from?" We arrived in Seattle on a June day. My first sight of the approaching land was an exhilarating experience. Everything seemed native and promising to me. It was like coming home after a long voyage, although as yet I had no home in this city. Everything seemed familiar and kind. The white faces of the buildings melting in the soft afternoon sun, the gray contours of the surrounding valleys that seemed to vanish in the last periphery of light. With a sudden surge of joy, I knew that I must find a home in this new land. I had only 20 cents left, not even enough to take me to Chinatown, where, I had been informed, a Filipino hotel and 2 restaurants were located. Fortunately, 2 old-timers put me in a car with 4 others and took us to a hotel on King Street, the heart of Filipino life in Seattle. Marcelo, who was also in the car, had a cousin named Elias, who came to our room with another old-timer. Elias and his unknown friend persuaded my companions to play a strange kind of card game. In a little while, Elias got up and touched his friend suggestively, and then they disappeared, and we never saw them again. It was only when our 2 countrymen had left that my companions realized what happened. They had taken all their money. Marcelo asked me if I had any money. I gave him my 20 cents. After collecting a few more cents from others, he went downstairs, and when he came back, he told us that he had telegraphed for money to his brother in California. All night we waited for the money to come, hungry and afraid to go out into the street. Outside we could hear shouting and singing. Then a woman screamed lustily in one of the rooms down the hall. Across from our hotel, a jazz band was playing noisily. It went on until dawn, but in the morning a telegram came to Marcelo which said, "Your brother died automobile accident last week." Marcelo looked at us and began to cry. His anguish stirred an aching fear in me. I knelt on the floor looking for my suitcase under the bed. I knew that I had to go out now, alone. I put the suitcase on my shoulder and walked toward the door, stopping for a moment to look back at my friends who were still standing silently around Marcelo. Suddenly, a man came into the room and announced that he was the proprietor. "Well, boys," he said, looking at our suitcases, "where is the rent?" "We have no money, sir," I said, trying to impress him with my politeness. "That is too bad," he said quickly, glancing furtively at our suitcases again. "That is just too bad." He walked outside and went down the hall. He came back with a short, fat Filipino who looked at us stupidly with his dull, small eyes and spat his cigar out of the window. "There they are, Jake," said the proprietor. Jake looked disappointed. "They are too young," he said. "You can break them in, Jake," said the proprietor. "They will be sending babies next," Jake said. "You can break them in, can't you, Jake?" The proprietor pleaded. "This is not the first time you have broken babies in. You have done it in the sugar plantations in Hawaii, Jake." "Hell!" Jake said, striding across the room to the proprietor. He pulled a fat roll of bills from his pocket and gave $25 to the proprietor. Then he turned to us and said, "All right, Pinoys, you are working for me now. Get your hats and follow me." We were too frightened to hesitate. When we lifted our suitcases, the proprietor ordered us not to touch them. "I'll take care of them until you come back from Alaska," he said. "Good fishing, boys." In this way, we were sold for $5 each to work in the fish canneries in Alaska by a Visayan from the island of Leyte to an Ilocano from the province of La Union. Both were old-timers. Both were tough. They exploited young immigrants until one of them, the hotel proprietor, was shot dead by an unknown assailant. We were forced to sign a paper which stated that each of us owed the contractor $20 for bedding and another $20 for luxuries. What the luxuries were, I have never found out. The contractor turned out to be a tall, heavy-set dark Filipino who came to the small hold of the boat barking at us like a dog. He was drunk and saliva was running down his shirt. "And get this, you devils!" he shouted at us. "You will never come back alive if you don't do what I say!" It was the beginning of my life in America. The beginning of a long flight that carried me down the years, fighting desperately to find peace in some corner of life. I had struck up a friendship with two old-timers who were not much older than I. One was Conrado Torres, a journalism student at a university in Oregon, who was fired with a dream to unionize the cannery workers. I discovered that he had come from Binalonan, but could hardly remember the names of people there because he had been very young when he had come to America. Conrado was small and dark with slant eyes and thick eyebrows, but his nose was thin above a wise, sensuous mouth. He introduced me to Paulo Lorca, a gay fellow who had graduated from law school in Los Angeles. This surreptitious meeting at Cannery and Rose Inlet was the beginning of a friendship that grew simultaneously with the growth of the trade union movement and progressive ideas among the Filipinos in the United States. In those days, labor unions were still unheard of in the canneries, so the contractors rapaciously exploited their workers. They had henchmen in every cannery who saw to it that every attempt at unionization was frustrated and the instigators of the idea punished. The companies also had their share in the exploitation. Our bunkhouses were unfit for human habitation. The lighting system was bad and dangerous to our eyes. And those of us who were working in the semi-darkness were severely affected by the strong ammonia from the machinery. I was working in a section called Wash Lie. Actually, a certain amount of lye was diluted in the water where I washed the beheaded fish that came down on a small escalator. One afternoon, a cutter above me, working in the poor light, slashed off his right arm with a cutting machine. It happened so swiftly, he did not cry out. I saw his arm floating down the water among the fish heads. It was only at night that we felt free. Although the sun seemed never to disappear from the sky, it stayed on in the western horizon, and its magnificence inflamed the snows on the island, giving us a world of soft, continuous light until the moon rose at about 10 o'clock to take its place. Then, trembling shadows began to form on the rise of the brilliant snow in our yard, and we would come out with baseball bats, gloves and balls, and the Indian girls who worked in the cannery would join us, shouting huskily like men. We played far into the night. Sometimes a Filipino and an Indian girl would run off into the moonlight. We could hear them chasing each other in the snow. Then we would hear the girl giggling and laughing deliciously in the shadows. Paolo was always running off with a girl named La Belle. How she acquired that name in Alaska, I never found out. But hardly had we started our game when off they ran, chasing each other madly and suddenly disappearing out of sight. Toward the end of the season, La Belle gave birth to a baby. We were sure, however, that the father was not in our group. We were sure that she had got it from one of the Italian fishermen on the island. La Belle did not come to work for 2 days, but when she appeared on the 3rd day with the baby slung on her back, she threw water in Conrado's face. Psh! "Are you going to marry me or not?" she asked him. Conrado was frightened. He was familiar with the ways of Indians, so he said, "Why should I marry you?" "We'll see about that," La Belle shouted. Running to the door, she came back with an official of the company. "That's the one," she said, pointing to Conrado. You'd better come to the office with us," said the official. Conrado did not know what to do. He looked at me for help. Paolo left his washing machine and nodded to me to follow him. We went with them into the building, which was the town hall. "You are going to marry this Indian girl and stay on the island for 7 years, as prescribed by law," said the official to Conrado. And as the father of the baby, you must support both mother and child. And if you have 4 more children by the time your turn is up, you'll be sent back to the mainland with a bonus." "But sir, the baby is not mine," said Conrado weakly. Paolo stepped up quickly beside him and said, "The baby is mine, sir. I guess I'll have to stay." La Belle looked at Paolo with surprise. After a moment, however, she began to smile with satisfaction. Paolo was well educated and spoke good English, but I think what finally drove Conrado from La Belle's primitive mind were Paolo's curly hair, his even white teeth. Meekly, she signed the paper after Paolo. "I'll stay here for 7 years, all right," Paolo said to me. "I'm in a mess in Los Angeles anyway, so I'll stay with this dirty Indian girl." "Stop talking like that if you know what is good for you," La Belle said, giving him the baby. "I guess you are right," Paolo said. "You shouldn't have done it for me," Conrado said. "It's all right." Paolo laughed. "I'll be in the United States before you know it." I still do not understand why Paolo interceded for Conrado. When the season was over, Paolo came to our bunks in the boat and asked Conrado to send him something to drink. I did not see him again. Chapter 14. When I landed in Seattle for the second time, I expected a fair amount of money from the company. But the contractor, Max Fuega, came into the playroom and handed us slips of paper. I looked at mine and was amazed at the neatly itemized expenditures that I was supposed to have incurred during the season. $25 for withdrawals, $100 for board and room, $20 for bedding, and another $20 for something I do not now remember. At the bottom was the actual amount I was to receive after all the deductions. $13! I could do nothing. I did not even go to the hotel where I had left my suitcase. I went to a Japanese dry goods store on Jackson Street and bought a pair of corduroy pants and a blue shirt. It was already twilight, and the cannery workers were in the crowded Chinese gambling houses, losing their season's earnings and drinking bootleg whiskey. They became quarrelsome and abusive to their own people when they lost, and subservient to the Chinese gambling lords and marijuana peddlers. They pawed at the semi-nude. They pawed at the semi-nude horse with their dirty hands and made suggestive gestures, running out into the night when they were rebuffed for lack of money. I was already in America, and I felt good and safe. I did not understand why. The gamblers, prostitutes, and Chinese opium smokers did not excite me, but they aroused in me a feeling of flight. I knew that I must run away from them, but it was not that I was afraid of contamination. I wanted to see other aspects of American life, for surely these destitute and vicious people were merely a small part of it. Where would I begin this pilgrimage, this search for a door into America? I went outside and walked around looking into the faces of my countrymen, wondering if I would see someone I had known in the Philippines. I came to a building which brightly dressed white women were entering. Lifting their diaphanous gowns as they climbed the stairs. I looked up and saw the huge sign, Manila Dance Hall. The orchestra upstairs was playing. Filipinos were entering. I put my hands in my pockets and followed them, beginning to feel lonely for the sound of home. The dance hall was crowded with Filipino cannery workers and domestic servants, but the girls were very few, and the Filipinos fought over them. When a boy liked a girl, he bought a roll of tickets from the hawker on the floor and kept dancing with her. But the other boys who also liked the same girl shouted at him to stop, cursing him in the dialects and sometimes throwing rolled wet papers at him. At the bar, the glasses were tinkling, the bottles popping loudly, and the girls in the back room were smoking marijuana. It was almost impossible to breathe. Then I saw Marcelo's familiar back. He was dancing with a tall blonde in a green dress, a girl so tall that Marcelo looked like a dwarf climbing a tree. But the girl was pretty, and her body was nicely curved and graceful, and she had a way of swaying that aroused confused sensations in me. It was evident that many of the boys wanted to dance with her. They were shouting maliciously at Marcelo. The way the blonde waved to them made me think that she knew most of them. They were nearly all old-timers and strangers to Marcelo. They were probably gamblers and pimps because they had fat rolls of money and expensive clothing. But Marcelo was learning very fast. He requested one of his friends to buy another roll of tickets for him. The girl was supposed to tear off one ticket every 3 minutes, but I noticed that she tore off a ticket for every minute. That was 10 cents a minute. Marcelo was unaware of what she was doing. He was spending his whole season's earnings on his first day in America. It was only when one of his friends shouted to him in the dialect that he became angry at the girl. Marcelo was not tough, but his friend was an old-timer. Marcelo pushed the girl toward the gaping bystanders. His friend opened the knife and gave it to him. Then something happened that made my heart leap. One of the blonde girl's admirers came from behind and struck Marcelo with a piece of lead pipe. Marcelo's friend whipped out a pistol and fired. Bang! Marcelo and the boy with the lead pipe fell on the floor simultaneously, one on top of the other. but the blonde girl ran into the crowd screaming frantically. Several guns banged at once and the lights went out. I saw Marcelo's friend crumple in the fading light. At once the crowd seemed to flow out of the windows. I went to a side window and saw 3 heavy electric wires strung from the top of the building to the ground. I reached for them and slid to the ground. My palms were burning when I came out of the alley. Then I heard the sirens of police cars screaming infernally toward the place. I put my cap in my pocket and ran as fast as I could in the direction of a neon sign 2 blocks down the street. It was a small church where Filipino farm workers were packing their suitcases and bundles. I found out later that Filipino immigrants used their churches as rest houses while they were waiting for work. There were 2 large trucks outside. I went to one of them and sat on the running board, holding my hands over my heart for fear it would beat too fast. The lights in the church went out and the workers came into the street. The driver of the truck in which I was sitting pointed a strong flashlight at me. "Hey, you! Are you looking for a job?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said. "Get in the truck," he said, jumping into the cab. "Let's go, Flo!" he shouted to the other driver. I was still trembling with excitement, but I was glad to get out of Seattle to anywhere else in America. I did not care where so long as it was in America. I found a corner and sat down heavily. The drivers shouted to each other. Then we were off to work. It was already midnight and the lights in the city of Seattle were beginning to fade. I could see the reflections on the bright lake in Bremerton. I was reminded of Baguio. Then some of the men began singing. The driver and 2 men were arguing over money. A boy in the other truck was playing a violin. We were on the highway to Yakima Valley. After a day and a night of driving, we arrived in a little town called Moxie City. The apple trees were heavy with fruit and the branches drooped to the ground. It was late afternoon when we passed through the town. The hard light of the sun punctuated the ugliness of the buildings. I was struck dumb by its isolation and the dry air that hung oppressively over the place. The heart-shaped valley was walled by high, treeless mountains, and the hot breeze that blew in from a distant sea was injurious to the apple trees. The leader of our crew was called Cornelio Paez, but most of the old-timers suspected that it was not his real name. There was something shifty about him and his so-called bookkeeper, a pock-marked man we simply called Pinoy, which is a term generally applied to all Filipino immigrant workers, had a strange trick of squinting sideways when he looked at you. There seemed to be an old animosity between Paez and his bookkeeper. But we were drawn together because the white people of Yakima Valley were suspicious of us. Years before, in the town of Topenish, 2 Filipino apple pickers had been found murdered on the road to Sunnyside. At that time, there was ruthless persecution of the Filipinos throughout the Pacific coast, instigated by orchardists who feared the unity of white and Filipino workers. A small farmer in Wapato who had tried to protect his Filipino workers had had his house burned. So however much we distrusted each other under Paez, we knew that beyond the walls of our bunkhouse were our real enemies, waiting to drive us out of Yakima Valley. I had become acquainted with an old-timer who had had considerable experience in the United States. His name was Julio, and it seemed that he was hiding from some trouble in Chicago. At night, when the men gambled in the kitchen, I would stand silently behind him and watch him cheat the other players. He was very deft, and his eyes were sharp and trained. Sometimes, when there was no game, Julio would teach me tricks. Mr. Monroe, our employer, had 3 daughters who used to work with us after school hours. He was a Frenchman who had gone to Moxie City when it consisted of only a few houses. At that time, the valley was still a haven for Indians, but they had been gradually driven out when farming had been started on a large scale. Monroe had married an American woman in Spokane and began farming. The girls came one by one, helping him on the farm as they grew. When I arrived in Moxie City, they were already in their teens. The oldest daughter was called Estelle. She had just finished high school. She had a delightful disposition, and her industry was something that men talked about with approval. The other girls, Maria and Diane, were still too young to be going about so freely. But whenever Estelle came to our bunkhouse, they were always with her. It was now the end of summer, and there was a bright moon in the sky. Not far from Moxie City was a wide grassland where cottontails and jackrabbits roamed at night. Estelle used to drive her father's old car and would pick up some of us at the bunkhouse. Then we would go hunting with their dogs and a few antiquated shotguns. When we came back from hunting, we would go to the Monroe house with some of the men who had musical instruments. We would sit on the lawn for hours singing American songs. But when they started singing Philippine songs, their voices were so sad, so full of yesterday and the haunting presence of familiar seas. As if they had reached the end of creation, that life seemed ended and no bright spark was left in the world. But one afternoon, toward the end of the season, Baez went to the bank to get our paychecks and did not come back. The pockmarked bookkeeper was furious. "I'll get him this time," he said, running up and down the house. "He did that last year in California and I didn't get a cent. I know where to find the bastard." Julio grabbed him by the neck. "You'd better tell me where to find him if you know what is good for you," he said angrily, pushing the frightened bookkeeper toward the stove. "Let me alone," he shouted. Julio hit him between the eyes and the bookkeeper struggled violently. Julio hit him again. The bookkeeper rolled on the floor like a baby. Julio picked him up and threw him outside the house. I thought he was dead, but his legs began to move. Then he opened his eyes and got up quickly, staggering like a drunken stave door toward the highway. Julio came out of the house with brass knuckles, but the bookkeeper was already disappearing behind the apple orchard. Julio came back and began hitting the door of the kitchen with all his force and futile anger. I had not seen this sort of brutality in the Philippines, but my first contact with it in America made me brave. My bravery was still nameless and waiting to express itself. I was not shocked when I saw that my countrymen had become ruthless toward one another, and this sudden impact of cruelty made me insensate to pain and kindness, so that it took me a long time to wholly trust other men. As time went by, I became as ruthless as the worst of them, and I became afraid that I would never feel like a human being again. Yet no matter what bestiality encompassed my life, I felt sure that somewhere, sometime, I would break free. This faith kept me from completely succumbing to the degradation into which many of my countrymen had fallen. It finally paved my way out of our small, harsh life, painfully but cleanly, into a world of strange intellectual adventures and self-fulfillment. The apples were nearly picked when Baez disappeared with our money. We lost interest in our work. We sat on the lawn of the Monroes and sang. They came out of the house and joined us. The moonlight shimmered like a large diamond on the land around the farm. The men in the bunkhouse came with their violins and guitars. Julio grabbed Diane and started dancing with her when the two younger girls were grabbed by other men. It was while Estelle was singing that we heard a gun crack from the dirt road not far from the house. Monroe saw them first, saw the clubs and the iron bars in their hands and yelling at us and warning. But it was too late. They had taken us by surprise. I saw Monroe run into the house for his gun. I jumped to the nearest apple tree. I wanted a weapon, anything to hit back at these white men who had leaped upon us from the dark. 3 or 4 guns banged all at once, and I turned to see Maria falling to the ground. A streak of red light flashed from the window into the crowd. Estella was screaming and shouting to her father. Diane was already climbing the stairs, her long black hair shining in the moonlight. I saw Julio motioning to me to follow him. Run away from our friends and companions? No! God damn you, Julio! I jumped into the thick of fight, dark with fury. Then I felt Julio's hands pulling me away, screaming into my ears. Come on, you crazy punk! Come on before I kill you myself! He was hurting me. Blinded with anger and tears, I ran after him toward our bunkhouse. We stopped behind a pear tree when we saw that our house was burning. Julio whispered to me to follow him. We groped our way through the pear trees and came out, after what seemed like hours of running, on a wide grass plain traversed by a roaring irrigation ditch. Once, when we thought we were being followed, we jumped into the water and waited. The night was silent. The stars in the sky were as far away as home. Was there peace somewhere in the world? The silence was broken only by the rushing water and the startling cry of little birds that stirred in the night. Julio led the way. We came to a dirt road that led to some farmhouses. We decided to stay away from it. We turned off the road and walked silently between the trees. Then we came to a wide desert land. We followed a narrow footpath and, to our surprise, came to the low, uninhabited, wide desert of the Rattlesnake Mountains. The stars were our only guide. We walked on and on toward dawn when a strong wind came. We jumped into the dunes and covered our heads with dry bushes until it had passed by. We were no longer afraid of pursuit. We were in another land, on another planet. The desert was wide and flat. There were rabbits in the bushes, and once we came upon a herd of small deer. We ran after them with a burning bush, but they stood nonchalantly and waited for us. When we were near enough for them to recognize our scent, they turned about and galloped down the sand dunes. When morning came, we were still in the desert. We walked until about noon. Then we came to a narrow grassland. We stood on a rise and looked around to see the edge of the desert. Julio started running crazily and jumping into the air. I ran after him. At last, we came to the beginning of a wide plain. The town of Topenish was behind us now, and the cool wind from the valley swept the plain. We rested under a tree. Julio was different from other old-timers. He did not talk much. I felt that he had many stories within him, and I longed to know America through him. His patience and nameless kindness had led me away from Moki City into a new life. After a while, we crossed the plain again, hiding behind the trees whenever we saw anyone approaching us. I was too exhausted to continue when we reached Zila, where some children stoned us. We hid in an orange grove and rested. At sunset, we started again. When we were nearing the town of Granger, I heard the sudden tumult of the Yakima River. Julio started running again and I followed him. Suddenly, we saw the clear, cool water of the river. We sat in the tall grass, cooling our tired bodies beside the bright stream. I was the first to enter the water. I washed my shirt and spread it to dry on the grass. Sunnyside was not far off. I could hear the loud whistle of trains running seaward. This is the beginning of your life in America, Julio said. We'll take a freight train from Sunnyside and go to nowhere. I would like to go to California, I said. I have 2 brothers there, but I don't know if I could find them. All roads go to California and all travelers wind up in Los Angeles, Julio said. But not this traveler. I have lived there too long. I know that state too damn well. What do you mean? I asked. Suddenly he became sad and said, It is hard to be a Filipino in California. Not comprehending what he meant, I began to dream of going to California. Then we started for Sunnyside, listening eagerly to the train whistle piercing the summer sky. It was nearly 10 in the evening when we reached Sunnyside. We circled the town, and then we saw the trains, every car bursting with fruit, screaming fiercely and chugging like beetles up and down the tracks. The voices of the train men came clearly through the night. We stopped in the shadow of a water tower. Julio disappeared for a moment and came back. "Our train leaves in an hour," he said. "I'll go around for something to eat. Wait for me here." I waited for him to come back for several hours. The train left. Then I began to worry. I went to town and walked in the shadows, looking into the darkened windows of wooden houses. Julio had disappeared like a wind. I returned to our rendezvous and waited all night. Early the next morning, another train was ready to go. I ran behind the boxcars and climbed inside one. When the train began to move, I opened the door and looked sadly toward Sunnyside. Julio was there somewhere, friendless and alone in a strange town. "Goodbye, Julio," I said, "and thanks for everything, Julio. I hope I will meet you again somewhere in America." The train screamed and the thought of Julio hurt me. I stood peering outside and listening to the monotonous chugging of the engine. I knew that I could never be unkind to any Filipino because Julio had left me a token of friendship, a seed of trust that ached to grow to fruition as I rushed toward another city. Chapter 15. Like a thundering river, the train rushed toward Pasco, crossing wide, level lands and passing through badlands, plateaus, and rill-marked hills. At Grandview, a prairie town whose sharp winds cut through the valleys and swept the plains, a dozen men jumped on and several of them came to my car. 2 looked like professional hobos, but the others were young men in search of work. I did not notice that there was a girl among them until we reached Kennewick, when the railroad detectives came to the boxes and scattered us among the trees. When they were gone and we had run back to the car, I learned that she was with her brother, who was younger than she. They were on their way to California, where an uncle was waiting for them. The sun went down slowly and sudden darkness came over the land. I sat back in my corner and tried to sleep, brushing off the obscene conversations of the men around me. Then, in the middle of the night, isolated in a corner of the box, I was awakened by the young girl's whimpering. She was desperately struggling with someone in the dark, breathing as though she were being choked to death. Then I heard her fall heavily on the floor, and she began to sob hopelessly. Her assailant dragged her to my corner. I could hear the man fumbling at her. He was staring hungrily at her clothes. I strained my eyes in the dark to see what was happening. After a while, the girl did not struggle anymore. She turned lifelessly toward me, and in the dark, I could hear her agony. With a sudden revulsion, I got up and felt for the man, but someone struck me on the head and I rolled on the floor. There was silence for a long time. Then as I returned to consciousness, I heard the stifled sobbing of the girl again. Another man approached her. When the train stopped, many of the men in our car jumped out. The girl crawled about in the dark, searching for her brother. Bill, honey, where are you?" she whispered. But the boy had disappeared in the night, afraid and alone. She leaned against the wall and cried brokenly. I got up from my corner and looked out. We were in Hood, on the Columbia River. It was dark, but I could hear the rushing water and somewhere on the other side of the town, the sharp whistle of another train. The girl spread some newspapers on the floor and lay down to sleep. I struck a match and watched her face affectionately. She looked a little like my younger sister, Francisca. There was a sudden rush of warm feeling in me, yearning to comfort her with the words I knew. This ravaged girl in this lonely night in a freight train bound for an unknown city. I could not hold back the tears that came to my eyes. When we reached Portland, it was already after midnight. The girl walked with me in the streets. "Where are you going?" she asked me. "I'm looking for an address," I said, trying to make her understand my broken English. "But the houses are too dark." "Do you have a friend here?" But she did not wait for an answer. "Let's go back to the station," she suggested. We found the train about ready to leave for California. A few men came into the car where the girl and I were sitting. Then a woman came in with her husband, who was carrying a baby. There was a Negro boy with a harmonica. He kept playing for hours, stopping only to say, "Salem, Eugene, Klamath Falls," when we passed through those places. The girl leaned on me and went to sleep, her breath warming my face. I dozed off and did not waken until the following morning. The girl was gone, but the newspapers on which she had lain were still warm. Everybody was gone except the Negro boy with the harmonica. He was still playing. I kept staring at him because it was the first time I had ever seen a black person. "Where are you going, boy?" he asked. "California, sir," I said. He laughed. "Sir?" "Yes, sir," I said again. "Boy, you are far from California." He laughed aloud, taking up the harmonica again. I opened the door and looked out. The train was still moving. When the train stopped at the station, the Negro boy began to laugh again. "Boy, boy, boy," he screamed. "This is Reno, Nevada." I went to the door again and looked out. Then I saw the startling sign. Reno, the biggest small city in the world. The girl had left 3 strands of her brown hair on my shoulder. I picked them up and wrapped them in a piece of newspaper. I did not know why I did it, but felt somehow that I would meet her again. Innocent looking she was, and forlorn, and I felt that there was a bond between us, a bond of fear and a common loneliness. When the Negro told me what train to take to California, I thanked him and left, hoping I would encounter him again. The cars were full of hobos and drifting men who sat on the floor eating stale bread and drinking cold coffee. The wide desert land was shimmering with heat, and except for a bit of brush here and there, it reminded me of my escape with Julio across the Rattlesnake Mountains. At last we came to some mountains, tall, frowning mountains and deep, narrow rivers rushing down the canyons. I counted 13 short tunnels before we came out to the border of California, rolling across a wide land of luxuriant vegetation and busy towns. Then there was a river, and not far off the town of Marysville loomed about a valley of grapes and sugar beets, all green and ready for the summer harvest. I wanted to stop and walk around town, but some of the hobos told me that there were thousands of Filipinos in Stockton. I remained on the same train until it got to Sacramento, where I boarded another that took me to Stockton. It was twilight when the train pulled into the yards. I asked some of the hobos where I could find Chinatown, for there I would be sure to find my countrymen. "El Dorado Street," they said. It was like a song, for the words actually mean the land of gold. I did not know that I wanted gold in the new land, but the name was like a song. I walked slowly in the streets, avoiding the business district and lights. Then familiar signs glowed in the coming night, and I began to walk faster. I saw many Filipinos in magnificent suits standing in front of pool rooms and gambling houses. There must have been hundreds in the street somewhere, waiting for the night. I walked eagerly among them, looking into every face and hoping to see a familiar one. The asparagus season was over, and most of the Filipino farmhands were in town, bent on spending their earnings because they had no other place to go. They were sitting in the bars and pool rooms, in the dance halls and gambling dens, and when they had lost or spent all their money, they went to the whorehouses and pawed at the prostitutes. I entered a big gambling house on El Dorado and Lafayette Streets. where 10 prostitutes circulated, obscenely clutching at some of the gamblers. I went to a stove in the middle of the room where a pot of tea was boiling. I filled a cup, and then another, and the liquid warmed my empty stomach. This was to save me in harsher times, in the hungry years of my life in America. Drinking tea in Chinese gambling houses was something tangible and gratifying, and perhaps it was because of this that most of the Filipino unemployed frequented these places. I was still drinking when a Chinese came out of a back room with a gun and shot a Filipino who was standing by a table. When the bullet hit the Filipino, he turned toward the Chinese with a stupid look of surprise. I saw his eyes, and I knew that the philosophers lied when they said death was easy and beautiful. I knew that there was nothing better than life, even a hard life, even a frustrated life. Yes, even a broken down gambler's life. And I wanted to live. I ran to the door without looking back. I ran furiously down the street. A block away, I stopped in a doorway and stood, shivering, afraid, and wanting to spit out the tea that I had drunk in the gambling house. When my heart ceased pounding, I walked blindly up a side street. I had not gone far when I saw a building ablaze. "What is it?" I asked the Filipino near me. "It is the Filipino Federation building," he said. "I don't agree with this organization, but I know why the building is burning. I know the Chinese gambling lords control this town." I did not know what he meant. I looked at him with eager eyes. "I don't know what you mean," I said. "I've just arrived in the United States." "My name is Claro," he said, extending a long thin hand and coughing behind the other. "I came from Luna, in the province of La Union. Let us go to my restaurant, and I will explain everything to you. Are you hungry, boy?" He was not much older than I, and he spoke my dialect. "I have not eaten for 2 days," I said. "You see, I took the freight train in Sunnyside, Washington." Claro hugged me. When he entered the restaurant, he locked the door, click, and put down the shades. Shh. "I don't want the swine in the street to see us," he said, going to the stove. "They disgust me with their filthy interest in money. That is why I am always behind in my bills. I like good people, so I am keeping this restaurant for them." I watched him prepare vegetable soup and fry a piece of chicken. When the pot started to boil, Claro put a record on a portable phonograph at the other end of the counter. Then there was a sudden softness in his face, and his eyes shone. He had put on a Strauss waltz. Going back to the stove, Claro raised his hands expertly above his head in the manner of boleros and started to dance, swaying gracefully in the narrow space between the stove and the counter. He was smiling blissfully, and when someone knocked on the door, he stopped suddenly and shouted, "Go away! This place is closed for tonight!" When he had placed everything on the counter, Claro took a chair and sat near me. "Listen, my friend," he said. "The Chinese syndicates, the gambling lords are sucking the blood of our people. The Pinoys work every day in the fields, but when the season is over, their money is in the Chinese vaults. And what do the Chinese do? Nothing! I see them only at night in their filthy gambling dens waiting for the Filipinos to throw their hard-earned money on the tables. Why, the Chinese control this town. The local banks can't do business without them, and the farmers who badly need the health and interest of their Filipino workers don't want to do anything because they borrow money from the banks. See?" I was too hungry to listen, but I was also beginning to understand what he was trying to say. "Perhaps in another year I will be able to understand what you are saying, Claro," I said. "Stay away from Stockton," he warned me. "Stay away from the Chinese gambling houses and the dance halls and the whorehouses operated by Americans. Don't come back to this corrupt town until you are ready to fight for our people." I thanked him and walked hastily to the door. I hurried to the freight yards. I was fortunate enough to find an empty boxcar. I sat in a corner and tried to sleep, but Claro's words kept coming back to me. He wanted me to go back to fight for our people when I was ready. I knew I would go back, but how soon I did not know. I would go back to Claro and his town. His food had warmed me, and I felt good.